Welcome, Yat. Everyone wants to be a crypto millionaire. So can you tell us how to do it?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't say that it's about necessarily becoming a millionaire. It's around understanding why Web3 matters and why blockchain and tokens and crypto actually matters in the future. And it's really about digital sovereignty and digital ownership. Your time online is valuable. And if you value online time, then you will understand the value of crypto.
So just reverse engineering that. What you're saying is people are online at the moment and they're spending time on platforms. We don't need to mention them. And those platforms are monetizing them. And what you're talking about is spinning that around, allowing you to monetize your time and not them monetize your time.
The most valuable resource on earth today is data.
Right.
Your time online is generating large quantities of this data. And actually, that doesn't go to you at all. In fact, you're spending time online and you think you're having fun and enjoying yourself. But meanwhile, they farm it and then they create huge amounts of value from it. And they sell it back to you in the form of advertising and marketing. And, you know, basically completely sort of colonizing your time and attention, which really you ought to be paid for.
Yeah, people need to wake up to this. They don't realize that their data is being used and being monetized and they're getting no benefit from it. So if people are listening and we've suddenly made them realize that, how do they protect themselves? How do they monetize their data? I mean, not everybody will want to necessarily monetize their data, but how do they? How do they monetize their data in today, in this period of history?
Well, I mean, I think the very first thing I would say is that even if it's not about monetizing your data, it's about owning your data first, right? Which is the whole sort of principle around building on blockchain. When you think about a token, for instance, the token represents the ownership in the network that you're constructing. So let's give an example. Let's say Instagram, right? You're posting photos on Instagram, you're sharing data. Actually, you're creating a community, you're creating a network. By getting a token, for instance, in Instagram, if there was such a thing, you become a stakeholder in the network that is Instagram. And every time you contribute value, you basically receive a form of tokens, which gives you a stake in the network, which means as Instagram keeps growing, you get a benefit of that growth as well. And of course, you only get a representation of that growth relative to your contribution. That's basically what that does. Tokens basically are proxies for the network effects inherent in the networks that you help build. But today, you don't receive anything. Today, for instance, when you're basically online, they just take all the data and they create value. And the value isn't the data itself; it's the derivative that the data creates, and you have no way of tracking that. So Web3 and blockchain solves that. The other thing is, you know, there's obviously hundreds of millions of people who use Instagram, and there's no really good way in which you can normally track ownership, let's say, of the Instagram network, because you know. You can have share registers that have, there's no company in the world that could have 100 million shareholders, but you can have 100 million token holders. And these 100 million token holders basically are representative of the network and the benefits of that network. And you see this today when you think about Ethereum, when you think about Bitcoin, when you think about, you know, Polygon, when you think about all of these different type of blockchains, they essentially are representations of these networks in which you can have ownership in.
I want to get into the technicalities in a minute of how each of the, I guess, cryptos and blockchain systems work, so people understand the difference between the technology and I guess the brand names like Bitcoin. In some respects, there's a brand name now in itself, right? What is the difference between, say, Bitcoin and Ethereum? We'll talk about that in a second. Just before we do, are NFTs a scam? That's what everyone seems to say to me now about NFTs. What do you think?
Well, they're absolutely not a scam in the sense that, you know, I think they represent digital property. And they actually represent the stores of that particular, so they represent stores of digital culture in the same way that, you know, we want to store ways of our physical culture. Often I give this example of a wedding ring, which is something that is, in its start, something that is the same everywhere around the world. But when you actually own that wedding ring, that actually becomes something unique to you and that has a cultural identity and a value and essentially becomes unique and therefore non-fungible in nature. And that's not necessarily about money. It's just about something that speaks to your personal identity. I think one of the reasons why people say in the past that NFTs are a scam is because, one, they don't understand what digital property is and what, you know, the meanings and intention behind it. And of course, anytime when you have money involved, there are people who are going to take advantage of it. And this is, by the way, true in all industries. This isn't related to just what's happening in Web3 or crypto. It happens in banking. It happens in other areas of finance. It happens in, goods like milk and, milk powder in China. Like all sorts of scams happen when there are bad people who take advantage of stuff. It doesn't matter if it's an NFT or it doesn't matter if it's basically a financial product, for instance, or, shares or whatever it is. I think, but when you're not in the space, you might only focus on the bad things. But NFTs today, for instance, as an example, do about $1.1 to $1.2 billion of sales every month. It has changed the lives of millions of people, not just in places like the Philippines, which have helped sort of include them financially, but also artists, musicians, and even teachers around the world are actually making a better and fairer income through NFTs, because an NFT isn't just a digital art, or, some people make fun about the fact that, it's like these monkey JPEGs, these Bored Apes, and it looks kind of funny and weird. That's not what you're buying. It's actually intellectual property that you're owning. And the entire future of our digital world is really intellectual property and how you protect and own that intellectual property rights. So I'll give you an example, for instance. With DanceFight, there's dancers out there who get their dance moves ripped off by the largest companies in the world because they're doing a cool dance move on TikTok. And then they just use that as a dance move in their game, like in Fortnite. But actually, when you take that move and you basically mint it on blockchain, you are proving that you are the creator of that dance move. And in US, for instance, trademark and copyright laws gives you essentially the copyright for that, which basically means that dance move now belongs to you, for instance, right? And the same could be said for digital art, or even teachers around the world who basically minting their learning programs as NFTs, which then allows other people to buy these NFTs to own the intellectual property that they've created. And some teachers have made between, half a year to a year's worth of their salary selling these NFTs, which is a more fair interpretation of the value, the intellectual value they're generating than today, basically earning very low wages.
I feel like 2 years ago, people were talking about NFTs, and that's now translated into somehow Web3, which seems more cool. But for people listening that don't understand what Web3 is, can you sum it up?
To understand Web3, let's go and talk about really what Web 1 and Web 2 is first, right? And why it matters. So Web 1, when we were originally started, in the early days of the internet, was a web of read. And that basically was, we had a web browser. It democratized access to information. Everyone could basically go online and basically receive news and data. And that was really the beginning in which we democratized access to that kind of information and had knowledge broadly available to everyone. Then in Web 2, we had the social web, which allowed people to write to the web, which meant that not only could we just consume stuff online, we could also contribute to it. And everyone became a content creator. And everyone was able to post stuff online. And that basically created value because it accelerated the access of more information that was compounding on other information and creating value this way. But the problem in Web 2 was, in order for it to work, you had to write to a database. And that database was centralized in nature. It belonged to someone. Whether this was Facebook, whether this was Amazon, whether this was Google, you wrote data to a centralized platform. And that data became very powerful and valuable. And that data today is powering the things like Google or OpenAI or all these major systems, self-driving cars, in which basically people who have created this value actually have no rights in it. And so Web3 is the next answer to this, where all of the stuff that you're reading and writing to the web can now be owned by you or by others, creating a marketplace, a fair marketplace for data, and also allowing basically to have access in that. And so that's why we call Web3 the web of ownership. So it goes, so Web 1 is read, Web 2 is read write, and Web 3 is read write and own. And the whole point is that when you have ownership, you have property rights. And when you have property rights, you can have capitalism and all the opportunities that come from owning things.
At HelpBnk, we're trying to help people and allow people to follow their dreams and get the knowledge they deserve, in part fix the education system. We want to leverage NFTs, Web3 tokens to do that. I'm scared of people's misunderstanding of what that might mean. But what do you think, best practice? Who's doing this well? Who's building good communities? Who's building good structures around leveraging tokens, NFTs, and community, in your opinion?
Well, I think first, let's talk about what are tokens representative of, and what does it mean when you run something on a blockchain, essentially on this thing that we call Web3. First, the entire blockchain ecosystem is run on what's known as a consensus mechanism, right? It's essentially community agreement. So in order to get, a transaction approved and to validate the transaction, you need the consensus of the entire network to say, yes, this was true, which to me is more than just a sort of database system. It's kind of a political, social system. It functions in a decentralized manner, meaning that the people around the network actually have a say in it, and it's not owned by a single party. In fact, it is decentralized against the entire community. So it is literally community ownership, or let's say a network that is community owned. whether this is Bitcoin, whether this is Ethereum, whether this is Polygon, or whether this is ones that are focused on particular communities. For instance, something, say, like Open Campus, which basically is an education sort of a platform that basically is tokenized. Or when you even think about something like a metaverse, like Sandbox, that's specifically around the world at a sandbox and people building economic opportunities around that, centered around the Sand token, for instance. Or for instance, for ApeCoin, which is a similar community that's focused around ape holders. That to me is no different than you having a Reddit community, or you having an Instagram following, or you having a fan community. You're actually really creating a network of your own. But what tokens allow you to do is enumerate the actual value of that network, and then basically being able to sort of distribute that value and power to the community that owns that network. Like today, fans, for instance, don't own a stake in the network that they've helped create. Whether you're a football player, whether you're a musician, whether you're a rock star, whether you're Simon Squibb, right? You have a following, you have a community, but they don't really have a stake in you. And even though they offer a value to your network, and tokens basically allow it to do that. I think the earliest example of something that is like that is Ethereum. But even though Ethereum obviously has smart contracts and is a blockchain, actually there's a community of tens of thousands of developers that are creating new applications that offer value to the Ethereum network in and of itself. New opportunities are being built, huge ecosystems have sprung up as a result. And the entire blockchain space today is a $2 trillion space as a result of that.
So tell us about the size of the market, because again, I mean, I was reading that there's only 300,000 very active people in crypto, which of course is probably more the whales than it is the actual mainstream. But how many people are engaging in this world? And is there a tipping point coming? Because I feel like probably a lot of people listening to this are scared to buy crypto or scared to get involved in the NFT world. I mean, tell us the size of the market, and tell us, if you're listening for the first time about this, the best way to get involved in it and understand it to make your life better later.
Well, the entire sort of Web3 crypto space right now is almost $2 trillion in size. The number of people that own crypto is about 400 million people and growing. And maybe the sort of hundreds of thousands of people you mentioned are the whales that are most active in the space. But that number is growing. I think it's said that something like, for instance, 22% of all Americans actually own crypto. There's another interesting fact, which is that the majority of the crypto is actually held by minority communities. So basically Asian Americans, Latinos.
Why is that, I wonder?
Well, I think a big part of that has to do with economic opportunity and access. One of the reasons why Web3 is growing the way that it is that it's the only mechanism in which you can actually have all sorts of people participate in an economic sort of framework that is inclusive.
Right.
I mean, for instance, even last year, everyone's talking about AI and open AI and all the opportunities that, of the growth of that market. Who got the benefit from that growth? The VCs, the big companies, all those guys.
That's a really fascinating point. So you're highlighting that crypto almost sounds like a negative word to some people, but that whole economy actually helps people get wealth and gain wealth. That whole movement of Web3 helps people make money, whereas AI in reality still furnishes the 1%'s pockets.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. The most of what we see in Web 2, including what we see in most of the AI movement, there is also Web 3 AI, but that's a different topic altogether. It doesn't actually allow for the inclusion of the rest of the population. They get to use the tools, but again, they have to pay for it. And who receives that value? The shareholders and essentially the 1% top. One of the big powerful things about Web3 is that it aligns the incentives of the network to create the network. So in a traditional sort of corporate setup, you have the shareholders, investors, and you have the builders, entrepreneurs that receive all the value. And then the rest of the ecosystem, even though they create value in the network, whether it's musicians, sort of people listening to your music, whether it's people participating in the network, whether it's people on Instagram or TikTok, for instance, they actually don't receive any value whatsoever except fame, reputation, and potentially some business opportunities that come from that. So it's that attention. Whereas in Web3, that value is distributed across all of the users, meaning that both users and creators, in many cases, might even receive a larger share of value than the investors, because they all essentially get to participate. And I think that also is the reason why the people are moving to Web3, because they see a way in which the time and effort that they're generating on these networks actually pays them the fair reward that makes it popular. I mean, think about it. If users were not using Instagram today, what's the value of Instagram? The answer is nothing. Right? So why shouldn't they be paid for that value. And the same goes in the gaming industry. So many people play games for free, and they think of it as free entertainment. But if those free players don't play those games, then other people who play the games wouldn't pay for it because there's no way in which you can basically interact with someone. So there is value. So we think that your time on Instagram, for instance, is you're like a free worker, shall we say. And I think this sort of Web3 really solves that. Some fact points, for instance, in 22, the total number of NFT sales was about $24 billion. But what's interesting is not the $24 billion of sales, which is, of course, quite meaningful. It's the fact that 90% plus of that value went to creators and owners of these NFTs. Whereas in that same year, Spotify, which obviously serves millions more creators, only paid out $8 billion in royalties to its entire network, which was basically, serves probably every musician in the world. And we all know that people can't make money as a musician on Spotify, but they can make money with NFTs. And this has a lot to do also with the fact that value is more fairly distributed. It's not so much that there wasn't that value there or that's value created out of thin air. It's just where is the value being distributed in the ecosystem. Maybe I'll give you one more example in the gaming industry. Over $100 billion is spent every year on what they call CPI, CPA ads to advertise games. That's $100 billion that goes to Apple, Google, Facebook, and everyone else on those advertising platforms. How much of that money do you think actually goes back into the gaming industry?
Sadly, not enough.
Almost nothing.
Nothing, right?
Right. It goes into
all those gamers could promote it probably better than.
And that's the point.
Apple and all those platforms anyway.
And so what happens in a Web3 framework, in a token economy, instead of paying Apple and Google for that, they actually pay the gamers. And they say, hey, because you're adding value to the game, you're making the game famous, or you're marketing the game, we're going to give you tokens and reward for that attention. And you get the benefit for that. Not only do we get the right audiences, basically, because we pay the gamers directly, the gamers may choose to cash out, but the chances that they reinvest it back into your game or another game or participate in the gaming ecosystem is infinitely higher than any of those platforms who have no incentive in the growth of the gaming industry. And that's the problem. Web2 platforms today are built to be highly extractive, and the community themselves doesn't get any of that benefit, which means that more and more of that rent has to go to the platform for essentially companies to succeed in the space. But who gets to lose? The actual end users. They have to pay more fees, they have to suffer more, they get more extracted, and at the end of the day, only the platforms win. And that's a big problem.
I translate the way you're saying is like communities that are on platforms end up owning the platform instead of the platform using them to make money.
Correct.
Right. And so if you're listening to this today and you want to build a business that is taking advantage of this new technology, you don't have any money, what would you do? What would you do? If you were listening to this podcast right now, knowing what you know, step by step, what would you do to help them?
Well, the very first thing I would do, other than just study the space, is join one of these communities because it's basically almost free to do so. I'll give you one example community we're involved in, which is the ApeCoin DAO. And so you talk about community-owned frameworks. These are generally known as decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs as they're known, which were the community of token holders basically control the treasuries and the value of that ecosystem, which they could then use to maybe invest or support a business. So let's say someone in your community wants to raise some money for a business. Well, they can go to the ApeCoin DAO and propose for some funding in a manner that would obviously benefit the community of ApeCoin. And today you have companies that make water, that make maybe some alcoholic products, that make T-shirts or make, like events, games, all funded through the ApeCoin DAO. But this DAO is not a VC. This DAO is run by the community and has today close to $2 billion of value that they can basically use to invest in these kind of projects. In fact, DAOs today have roughly $20 billion of value that could be given to new startups that is entirely owned by the community. This is pretty revolutionary because before, if you want to raise money, you have to go to a VC. You have to go to the 1 percentile and ask them for money, as opposed to now, where you can basically go to a community that has control of this. We also think that DAOs are going to be the future of organizations because they're just better incentive models than, going for the traditional corporate shareholding model, which was, the other thing is the corporate model, the limited corporation, was actually an innovation that is really only 30 or 40 years old. It's not something that has existed forever, right? So it was a way in which you could have more people participate with this kind of limited liability. So entrepreneurs were encouraged to take sort of risk and everything. Point being, though, that this corporate structure that we have today is not the final answer to corporate systems. It was flawed. Yeah, it's flawed, and it was an interim step.
Allow a community to own a part. Like HelpBnk, I'd love it if 125,000 people that are on HelpBnk today, when we're recording this, could all own a part of HelpBnk. Like, get into all sorts of legal issues.
In the corporate,
won't have that many shareholders.
That's right. And it's hard to manage. Also, there's structural issues around this. But actually, when you think about it in the framework of a network, HelpBnk is a network. It's a network that helps each other. How do you enumerate the value of that network? How can you participate and support the growth of that network? You could do it through a Web3 framework, like a blockchain or with a token infrastructure. And that is no different than if you're running something like, an Ethereum as a layer 1 or ApeCoin as a culture token. Either way, it's a way in which you can sort of create the sort of network value and share that network value and have people participate in it.
Is it as simple as creating a token and allowing people to have that token? Is it that simple, and then it being on a central exchange for it to be traded? Or
no, I mean, I think there's more complexities around that. I mean, a lot of people oversimplify this and think of just issue a token. There's a lot of things that go into issuing a token. You obviously need, the smart contract. You need to audit it. You need to also create the utility for it. People understand how you use it and how value can be generated from it for the participating community. There's many things one has to think about. But again, it is no different, I would say, than setting up a business and setting about, a business model and setting sort of the frameworks of that business and the mission behind that. I think you have to go through exactly the same steps. Maybe the technology is different, or maybe some of the paradigms are different. But at the end of the day, whether this is a company, whether this is a token, it still serves a human purpose. And it still serves a goal that is supposed to help people or serve people in one form or the other. And therefore, I would say the thought process isn't that different, but it still involves, obviously, effort.
I feel like every single day someone launches some shit meme coin. Are they following that framework, or how they seem to be popping up everywhere, and that creates a feeling of a scam because they launch, they blow up, and then they die.
So meme coins are, I guess, one example of what you can do with tokens. But I think of meme coins not necessarily purely as scams, although many of them are, and they're absolutely sort of buyer beware, I would say. But they are a representation of culture as well, right? If someone launches a meme coin, it's part of it is taking the mickey out of something.
Elon Musk says something and then make a meme coin. Right?
And I think, when you think of it from the framework of just having fun and you're just basically experimenting and playing around, then really that's how I think you could view a meme coin. I don't think anyone should be looking at a meme coin as any kind of serious investment, and anyone who does, I think needs to sort of really reconsider very carefully. It's really more about sort of people just having fun, and people are just basically sort of doing some silly stuff. But of course, because of the fact that capital can form so quickly in Web3, it can generate basically sort of the situation. But, I would also say any person who actually invests in a meme coin ought to know what they're doing.
Yeah.
In the sense that,
ought to.
Yeah. Well, the point, I guess what I'm saying is that I think no reasonable person would think that buying a meme coin is a guarantee to success or is an investment product of any type of sort. We certainly don't endorse it. But again, it's like, if you go ahead and invest in, all sorts of, funny online products, or if you were to purchase things that appear like the back in the old days, like the Nigerian scams and so on. Well, I mean, I think what
there is someone sitting there with 100 billion worth of gold they want to send me. I'm sure of it.
Yes,
someone was actually sitting there with gold, sending out emails. I've sent millions of emails. No one wants this gold.
Yeah.
But just be aware, right?
Yes.
I guess, again, I'm just thinking about the people listening to this. They see meme coins, they see NFTs. I mean, even Bored Apes, which, you just described the Bored Apes scenario. Bored Apes were sold as like this JPEG that Eminem bought for $2 million that's now only worth 80. Oh, it's a scam. They're missing the point that it's a community behind it.
Correct.
And it's still there. And that community is still there. And that community is still bringing value to the world and extracting value, right? It still exists.
And it's also a way to join the membership of that community, where when you are part of the Bored Ape community, you actually have access to everyone else in there. And there's a respect for that, right? For instance, you have a Bored Ape and Snoop Dogg has a Bored Ape, and you're basically part of that same network. There's value with that. And when you go to an event, for instance, like Ape Fest, you actually get to hang out with those type of...
It's like a social club, in a way.
It's a social club. And I think this is the other thing that I think a lot of people sometimes sort of don't distinguish around why many people purchase things. And like, I often give this example between a Bored Ape and a Birkin bag. And, you don't buy a Birkin bag because you want to use it to put stuff in it. You buy a Birkin bag because it gives you a kind of social status, a social signaling that means something to you. And I would argue that everything we purchase probably the majority of things we purchase is not for its utility, but is for its social signaling. And the social signaling, by the way, doesn't mean that it has to be expensive. It just says something about you. For instance, if I decide to wear green clothes or black clothes or blue clothes, there's a reason behind that. Maybe it's an identity I like. Maybe it's an image I like. It still says something about who I am, right? And so for most people, money is a means to a social end, we would say, meaning that I'm buying this to be a member of this society, whether I want to live in this district, whether I want to live in this country, whether I want to have this type of car, whether I want to have this kind of watch, right? I mean, people don't buy a Rolex to tell the time. They buy it because, again, they want to represent some membership or some social status. Maybe it's just for themselves. Maybe it's a signal to the world. And in Web3, that signal to the world isn't just individual to you and your private network. It gets amplified to the world because it's online. Every time a person buys a Bored Ape, for instance, the entire Bored Ape community and the entire Web3 community knows that this happened because it happens on chain. Whereas in the physical world, I might buy a Gucci bag and I will have it. And I like the fact that some other celebrities have it and it makes me feel good. But actually, that celebrity doesn't know you bought a Gucci bag. Or, some other person around the world that also owns the same Gucci bag doesn't know you own that bag. And you've never created that sense of community. And so these network effects compound in Web3, which is a reason why these digital assets in Web3 accelerate, because you have these network effects that compound on top of each other in which you can participate in. Whereas in Web2, those network effects compound the same way, except they only compound to the value of the companies that own these networks.
At HelpBnk, we want to eventually create a token. And the reason is that people want to help. And this is another way that they can help. But also, because they, like you're saying, they want to show that they're helping, which I think is actually nothing wrong with it. It shows that you care about the same things, of your community, what you care about.
Yes.
I think also the charity model is flawed. The general charity model is flawed. People will give money to something that, that's it, the money's gone. You give it once and it's gone. People want to feel a sense of investment, sustainability within the charity sector. So maybe talk from your experience about how you see not only this technology maybe underpinning charity activity, but also how you think it's going to play out, in the future of businesses that are built.
So generally, maybe before we even go there, how do networks grow and why do you participate in a network? From a human standpoint, it's around social signaling, right? When you think about why I joined Instagram, I don't just join it for myself. I join it to signal something to either my network or broader network and expand the network, whichever. So it's about building your own network effects that have an impact on your social status or your social signaling that you want to represent. So the same is true when you think about charity. And I think one of the flaws of charity, which is the one-way road of I give you money and you build something, is that the ability for me to sort of signal that I participated in this charity and I'm supporting it is very hard. I might get a sticker, I might get a benefit, maybe even a certificate. And that's maybe just for me. I don't have a way to tell people, and I don't have a way for other people in the network to know how the network is growing. I also can't bring attention to the cause that I'm trying to push. Whereas in Web3, you can know that at scale. And that also means that when I own a token related to that, I'm actually sending a message as well. If I own, for instance, if you were to issue a token and it was the HelpBnk token, then I'm signaling to the world, even if I'm not spending it, that I'm a member of HelpBnk and that I'm here to want to help people. It also says that other people can approach you to say, oh, you know what? You're a HelpBnk member. That means maybe you're the kind of person...
Same values.
Yeah, you have same values that you want to help someone. And that's actually also what NFTs do. If I share in the values of Bored Apes or of Mocaverse or of Cool Cats or whatever that might be, right, then actually I will actually own this NFT to be part of that network, and immediately other people will share in that. And also third parties who you might not know and who may not own the same token that you do will maybe come and offer you benefits and services. One of the biggest problems in traditional marketing on social media is you can't actually target your customers. They say, the irony about Web2 advertising is you're supposed to be able to target your customers. Good luck doing that, right? You get a dashboard and you get an approximation of trying to get the audience, but you actually don't know that it's your audience because it's, going to 10 million people, of which only a fraction might be the people you want. But in Web3, you can go directly to the customer. Whether he owns a Bored Ape, he's a certified person who owns a Bored Ape. Whether he owns maybe the HelpBnk token, that's a certified person who provably owns the token. Therefore, he's more likely to be wanting to help your cause than just randomly going to 10 million people out in the world who potentially might be interested in this. And I think the Web2 platforms do this intentionally because they want you to spray and pray, because they want you to basically waste as much money as possible so their profits are large, which, they have probably the most cash in the world today, larger than many nations. So I think the way that a token could work here is that owning this token gives us social signaling. People can use the token to give to other projects as a way of, funding them. And every time, and this I think is a powerful part about Web3 is, every time someone else buys a token, even just to hold, they're creating value for the token. They're creating more network effects, which then basically makes your ability as someone who wants to help other companies more powerful. Right? Think about what happened to the Ethereum and the Bitcoin network over the last 10 years or so. What happened to those networks when people basically held on to them and ended up telling people about it? When you have ownership in it, you also end up wanting to tell other people about it. Ownership is one of the most powerful sort of human things where it's not just about promotion. It's about being proud about it. It's about basically saying, hey, I'm proud about what Bitcoin represents. I'm proud about what Ethereum represents. And in this case, you could say, I'm proud about what HelpBnk represents. Each of the token holders who become a form of property owner in your network then essentially become your agents, because they are now a stakeholder in your network.
I hope people listen to this, because I think this whole world you're describing right now, people don't understand it. The majority of people still don't understand its ability to, I think, create real democracy. Right now we are sold this concept that we are in control, but we're not really, right? I mean, we don't own our data. Even if you have a house or mortgage, you don't own it, the bank does. Right? There's this whole misconception about ownership. Even your car, if you're on finance, isn't yours until you paid off the last payment. And so I think, how disrupted is the world? Everyone's talking about AI disrupting everything. And I think that Web3 seems to have gone a bit quiet on this front. I think Web3 is far more disruptive as far as ownership is concerned.
Yes.
What are the companies 10, 15 years from now going to look like? Someone said to me the other day, Ethereum is the biggest potential competitor to Amazon.
Oh, I agree with that. It's not just the biggest competitor to Amazon. I think it's... So the thing about blockchain is a public infrastructure, public data infrastructure, which has a redundancy and safety of an Amazon and a Goldman Sachs combined. And it's available for everyone to use. Most people might not appreciate just how powerful that is. That means someone with an idea to innovate a financial revolution or a better data structure or a better, safer data structure can now do this without having to build that same infrastructure. Imagine if you want to build a banking-grade data structure. You'd have to spend hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars to do it. And here is Ethereum that basically offers this exactly same infrastructure, basically for the cost of gas. You have to program, yes, and then you get to participate in a network that provides you the same security and the same frameworks around that. That's the reason why you can have digital property rights now, because a network like Ethereum provides a secure framework through smart contracts for you to do that without having to replicate that entire infrastructure. The other thing about community ownership that's so important to understand is that even in Web 2, nothing is free. Right? I'm using Amazon. I'm posting something on Instagram. It's actually Facebook on the back that's paying the fees, or it's Amazon on the back paying the fees. So I think, or whoever's using the Amazon Web Service is paying the fee. So there's nothing that's really free. But as an end user, I think it's free because I'm not paying a network fee, because the company that's hosting it is paying the network fee. But the company that's hosting the network fee is extracting other kinds of value from you in order for them to make it worth it. And the point is that that value is very high. Whereas in Web3, every person is paying the transaction fee. So for instance, in Ethereum, they call that gas. Every time I make a small transaction to transfer one thing to another, to do a transaction, to do a purchase, I pay a small amount of money in gas, and different blockchains have different fees. But the point is the cost of that gas ensures that the network is operating because it's paid for by the people who maintain the network, right? So it's basically a community payment system, you could say, that maintains the sanctity of the network. It also ensures that it remains decentralized because no single entity basically can take control of it because it's paid for by the community. So it's a community network that is paid for by the community, sustained by the community, which basically no corporate network can usurp. If you wanted to take control of Ethereum, you'd have to buy a majority of the tokens of Ethereum out there. That would cost you probably trillions of dollars. It's uneconomic, right? You can't take control of that network. Even Facebook and Apple and Google combined wouldn't be able to afford to sort of co-opting that network. And that's exactly why we also think of Web3 as a people's movement, right? It is one that is a people's movement because it's decentralized.
There was talk at one point if Facebook was going to try and do its own token.
Correct.
And they couldn't do it because they're centralized, right?
So the reason they couldn't do it is, you're talking about Libra.
Yeah.
And the idea behind that was to create essentially new financial infrastructure and blockchain technology around that, which tells me very clearly that obviously Mark Zuckerberg gets it. He understands what the future is going. But he was not allowed to do it because governments around the world were like, wait a second, Facebook has caused enough harm in social media and in Web 2. We need to be careful about what this means when he starts issuing his own token in a blockchain. And they made it very difficult for him to basically do that. And what's happened now is that a number of blockchains that came from Facebook's labs basically left Facebook and launched their own ecosystems, and there will be apps.
That's another exciting opportunity. I mean, you and I are old enough to remember that, the web revolution.
Yes.
Back in 2000 when it collapsed and everyone said, well, the headline was 1 million people leaving the internet. No one cares about the internet anymore.
Of course.
It kind of reminds me of that era. History repeats itself, doesn't it? A lot of people have seen that Amazon stock drop 97%.
Yes.
People thought, that's it. No one's going to be buying anything from Amazon. The .com is over.
Correct.
It feels like we've just gone through that a little bit with kind of the Web3 movement where people have speculated on it and then left. But slowly it is building back up. I mean, I see it. Yes, and in some cases, some NFT projects, I mean, I personally made $40,000 on one NFT project.
Yeah.
I've just spent $4,000 buying a Mocaverse, which I'd love to talk about in a moment.
Sure. Yeah.
But is it history repeating itself with this technology and people are missing it?
Well, generally speaking, what you're seeing is disruption. And every time there's disruption, and because it's disruption in this capitalist framework, we have these volatile cycles. Whether this is .com, whether this is mobile, whether this is energy, it doesn't really matter. There are always these cycles that happen. And what we saw in Web3 was a similar type of cycle. And some of the issues that we had in Web3 as well were some of these scams that took place, right? Whether it was Terra Luna, whether it was FTX. And I think a lot of confidence was lost at the time because people thought, wait a second, if we can't trust what happened before, how do we trust what's going on? And of course, the amazing thing about blockchain is actually you can verify everything on blockchain. Right. It's actually in the most transparent system out there. But we didn't have any knowledge as to how to look at that because we're unfamiliar with it. And I think the same was with the early days of the internet. There was unfamiliarity.
Well, people were buying fake goods on Amazon, for example, and thinking they were real. So
correct.
That didn't mean Amazon was a problem. It meant the systems needed to tighten up.
Exactly. And you needed whether it was regulation. Exactly. Whether it's regulation, whether it's community frameworks, whether it's other ways in which, like today, for instance, you can't really do these sort of, 401 scams anymore over email because everyone knows that there's a scam. Even though people will try, actually it doesn't work anymore because we've grown up. We understand it better. I think one of the big challenges about that people have and the opportunities around Web3 is that people don't understand how network layers function. In Web 2, the reason why network layers are sort of so distributed and so disparate is because you have to cobble them together. For instance, if I want to have a payment system to my website that might operate my game, I need to have a data structure for my game, I need a data structure for my website, and I have a data structure for my payment system, which means I might have to integrate PayPal into my MySQL database, into my Amazon framework, whatever that is. I have to sort of cobble systems together, which means I'm only really tapping into a small percentage of the network potential because I'm basically cobbling things together. On blockchain, all of these rails are on the same system, meaning that when I sell an NFT, which is a digital asset, I actually do the payment over the same system using a token over blockchain. So the payment layer, call it a payment system or a banking system, is shared on the same network as the one that's transferring value, selling a good, or being a social network. And that basically allows for these networks to form and the value that's created from that. And I think a lot of people don't understand the potential of what happens when you basically create this kind of unfettered access of networks that have come together.
I saw a picture of you standing with Jamie Dimon recently,
Yes.
And I loved the quote you said in the post, does he realise what I do for a living?
Yes.
Is there a...
I was also with Tony Blair in that same...
Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
I wonder that there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, like Jamie Dimon will say, do not buy crypto, and then the business he runs buys crypto.
Yes.
I mean, what's actually happening in your opinion?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a healthy dose of politics that's involved. I think, as I said earlier, blockchain isn't to be looked at only as a technology. It's a political, social, economic movement. And its underpinning is capitalism. But it's still a movement that is quite sort of, I would say, for some people threatening. One of the things that people are threatened around is the fact that if I have assets in crypto, as in tokens, then do I need the US dollar, for instance, right? So from a national standpoint, there's a big thematic around de-dollarization. One of the reasons why most of the world, except the US, so if you look at, for instance, Hong Kong, Japan, Middle East, Southeast Asia, even China has a blueprint on Web3 and is saying that, they think blockchain is the future. They're all trying to push a new narrative, a new alternative, because they want to move away from this dependency of the US dollar. They're not trying to kill it, I would say, but they're definitely trying to make it more honest, because we all know how weaponized the US dollar can be. The other aspect, of course, is they also want to create new technology frameworks away from US dependency. We're in Europe, we're here in London. The entire sort of UK has been essentially colonized by US technology companies, right? LinkedIn, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, they own your country. It was only about a month or two ago when Canadian news media got deplatformed by Facebook because Facebook disagreed with their demand for getting paid for the news content that they thought Facebook owed them.
Crazy.
Right. So a private corporation in America that has no national interest in the interest of Canada basically became the biggest threat to the democratic institution, which is free media and news.
Crazy.
In Canada, which is a democratic country. And they could do this every place in the world.
Yeah, the power they have, the tech companies. My favorite Xbox game, I won't name it, but the whole premise of the game is Google becomes the fourth world war is against Google. So all the countries have to team up to be able to win against them because they control everything. They control the sat-nav almost. They control the mapping of the world. They control the AI robots that are apparently coming to kill us all. They invented them. They own the companies that make them. That's an army they're building there, right?
Right.
You think that world is possible?
No, I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think the monopoly on violence will still belong to national countries, right? So at the end of the day, I don't believe that we're going to be in a future where Facebook or Google have an army, right? So that's kind of the buck stops there, I would say. But the point that you are in a situation where they can even have that bargaining power is a ridiculous part. And so the reason why many sort of, for instance, Hong Kong or even China or Japan actually are so desperate to move away from this dependency is that they realize that essentially US-based technology and US companies that don't have the national interest at heart could actually completely sort of alter the political sentiment and stability of the country.
People don't understand about China, right? A lot of people don't understand this about China. Facebook's banned in China. Well, it's partly to keep their own country stable, isn't it?
Correct. Yes.
Why would you let a foreign entity have control over what your people see and don't see?
And that's, by the way, most people also don't realize just sort of how these platforms don't exist, in South Korea in this way, for instance, as well, right? There's been rules around that really to protect the national interest of that country. And I think in the case of, for instance, Europe, they've completely sort of been blindsided by it and have basically become dependent on it. But again, I would argue that Web3 provides a new framework because it's not about one country or another country owning it. The point about Web3 is that now the community owns it. And
people own it. Real democracy.
Exactly. It's perhaps the most democratic form.
Well, you can't go after anyone either. Like, if they don't like Ethereum, who are they actually going to go after?
Correct.
The inventor doesn't own it. Yes. He might own some, but he doesn't own it.
Correct.
That's really interesting legally, isn't it? And the decentralization side of it actually doesn't allow for typical prosecution structures, for example.
Well, I mean, I think the other thing also is that it's not just that. It's that the more decentralized the network is, the more valuable and powerful the network becomes.
Yeah, governments must be running a little bit scared of this, though. I would say that they can't control it. You can't really even legislate against it. Like China banned Bitcoin, but it didn't stop it. Bitcoin went up the day that they banned it.
Well, no. So you can own Bitcoin in China. You just can't trade it, right? So I think the narrative in China, and this is, I think, where Hong Kong's role comes in, is that similar to foreign currencies and assets, Hong Kong becomes a gateway for digital assets for people from the mainland to the rest of the world.
Wow.
In the same way that you see this...
So you think Hong Kong's going to be the main gateway in the future if they get it right?
Absolutely. I think so, yes. Yeah. And that's also the reason
I love
why...
Hong Kong, so I hope so.
Yeah, and that's also the reason why Hong Kong has been so sort of friendly to Web3 in the sense that they've been positive regulations. I would say one of the biggest digital assets hubs and crypto hubs in the world is now Hong Kong, alongside Dubai and Singapore.
Right. No, I think that's interesting. From, I guess people get a bit confused as well about centralized and decentralized. So, of course, the exchanges were centralized, and yes, there's been some controversy. But some of those exchanges have come through the other side, like Coinbase. Is brilliant exchange.
And they're great company.
They're a great company.
Exactly.
I know you invested in them. I guess what makes the difference between these ones that I guess don't do well and the ones that do? Is it governance? Is it how do you when you have a decentralized system, who keeps the rules in line? Like, for example, Bored Apes.
Yes.
If suddenly they decided to change the policy and do something bad with that power, how is it governed?
So first, centralized exchanges or centralized platforms are obviously regulated. And so you should be operating with the regulated exchanges. And one of the problems we had in the past is that a lot of trading happened in these unregulated exchanges that were sort of based out of Bahamas and other places. So you really didn't know, what was happening. You just trusted that they did. And I think one of the problems is that we've become so accustomed to trusting platforms. We trust Amazon. We trust Facebook with identity. We trust Google with our information. Actually, even though they abuse it, we've come to be trained that way, that we think that that's okay.
There was a massive data leak recently on Google, and somehow it's kind of hush a little bit. Hundreds of millions of people's details released.
Yeah.
But people don't want the system to lose confidence. I think it's kind of kept quiet.
Yeah, and I think this is the struggle that you have with sort of centralized systems, that they're still subject to basically all these problems, except that they're also governed by a few, right? It's not governed by a network at large. Now, when you're building in decentralized system, fully decentralized, like, basically on blockchain, on chain, the thing is everything's done transparently, which means that when there's a problem, the whole world knows as well. So when there is a hack that happens in a decentralized exchange, if that happens, or if someone takes, steals money from a wallet, then the whole world knows about this. And actually, a lot of people can then act in real time because they see it's like seeing your transactions happening in real time in the rest of the world. One way to think about Web3 is like, imagine if you could see every time someone made a like on Instagram or did a reaction on TikTok, and there was a public data layer that would constantly update everyone in the world what was happening in real time. That's basically what blockchain is. So it's incredibly transparent. It's also quite daunting because you get all these data feeds, but then you have people building applications to analyze this, which also means that you can actually measure at the same time, for instance, what videos might go viral, what content is successful, not by you browsing the interface, but by you getting essentially the fire hose of data that will be provided in essentially a public data infrastructure. That's blockchain, which also means that you now have many more public people that can look at stuff and audit and secure it. One of the problems in centralized networks is you have only one group that can basically keep it safe, the owner of the network. So if Google fails, it fails. You don't have anyone else in the community.
Well, they're too big to fail, right?
Well, yes.
That's the theory.
Yes. But that aside, if there's a problem with Google, only Google can fix it. Only Google can analyze it. Only Google can warn us. But actually, if it's a public network that's owned by the community, the entire community is responsible for it. And you have more than one party, in fact, you have thousands of them, that are basically making sure that the network stays successful, not only because maybe it's their duty or they think it's a responsibility, but because they are also owners of the network. If I'm a reasonable owner in, basically Ethereum or in some L1 blockchain or in ApeCoin, and if I see a problem that's happened in my blockchain, then I have a vested interest in making sure that it stays successful. And therefore, I want to make sure it stays safe. So the incentives are aligned.
Naval said that everybody should get rich and that everybody can get rich. And I actually like that idea. I mean, you and I have been around long enough to see the middle class in China grow by 400 million plus people, and it's been a good thing for China. What's your take on that?
I think everyone should have the opportunity to get rich if they want to. I think that's a great promise of capitalism. I think it's a great promise of our modern societies that we have a chance to do that. I mean, if you think about our histories, many of us were denied that opportunity because of social, societal, and legal structures. And we can do that today. But I would also argue that that's become much harder now because access to being able to have sort of the opportunity for wealth creation is no longer based on labor. In the last sort of 30 or 40 years, capital was the area in which you could have value, meaning that the ability to invest and build capital, whether this was the ownership in goods, ownership in shares, ownership in real estate, versus basically, working for it, because the value of labor basically was constantly on the decline. And I think this is the big problem we have today. Most people still live in a labor economy, even though in capitalism, we've shifted to a world in which capital has way more value.
What is Elon Musk doing at X? What's his plan?
Elon Musk? Geez, I wish I knew what he was doing. I mean, I think everyone knows that Elon Musk was thinking about essentially creating X to a kind of mini WeChat, I would say.
Right. Super app.
Super app. So
I just feel it must involve blockchain the way it's going. I just feel like that.
Well, I mean, one thing we do know is that he has an interest in Bitcoin. He sometimes says funny things about Doge. He's sort of in the space of blockchain. But I also think that Elon is very much sort of seeking attention wherever attention is. So, I think in the last year, he was less focused on that because Web3 and broadly crypto has been not doing so well. And now with Bitcoin at $52,000, I mean, that's the other crazy thing, right? About a year plus ago, Bitcoin was $17,000 and now it's $52,000. I can't think of any other asset class of that size that has grown to this value over that short period of time. So I would imagine that the Bitcoin narrative will come back to Elon. So we'll probably hear him talk about it again.
Again, I love the point that, I mean, crypto is always framed as this hugely speculative, dangerous thing, which of course people need to go into it with caution. But it is also the thing that can give people that don't have much a big return, like no other product can. As far as like creating wealth's concerned, it's kind of been incredible, isn't it? I mean, I remember watching a video, and again, maybe we'll put the clip up. I remember watching a video when Bitcoin went to $100. You see that guy, like, oh my God, it's hit $100. And here it is at 52,000. I mean, it's probably going to halve at some point again in the future and then double again. But some people are talking about going to 1 million. Do you think that's likely? I mean, it seems so crazy, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
Again, caveat, no one should buy it. We're not saying no one should buy it, but like, how can it be? People listening I don't think they understand how something that doesn't produce anything, it doesn't sell anything. How can it be worth so much? And surely it's a bubble. I think that's what people are thinking.
What is gold? Why does gold have value?
Well,
can you eat gold?
Well, people can wear gold. I guess that's
so you're not going to tell me that so many people in the world would love to wear gold. That's why it has value. But I think the thing to understand about money generally and value is that it is generally to be looked at as a kind of fiction as well. Money is fiction.
Yeah, stock market is kind of fiction.
Right. But it's a fiction and a common reality we share that we agree in, right? So we agree that money has value. And it's because we trust and agree that we can use it as this medium.
So a country does Brexit, and overnight it loses 15% of its value, but nothing's changed economically, but now it's worth 15% because of Brexit, right? So it's worth what we think it's worth.
Exactly. But also when you think about gold, what makes gold valuable is the fact that, versus silver or platinum or any other rare material, is that it's basically become the way in which we think of storing value that essentially is not something that you can inflate because you have to work for it. And that's actually, in some ways, you can think of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a representation of that digital type of gold. It's essentially our reserve currency of Web3.
Plus, you don't have to store it. Well, actually, gold you have to store. It's an expensive thing to hold gold.
Yes, but I mean, you store Bitcoin. It's just it's a small amount.
It doesn't cost anything.
Yeah, really. Comparatively speaking, but it does cost to store it in a way that it's secure. You have to have, you have to. If you just store it basically in some kind of public wallet,
even nano stick.
Yeah, well, yes, but I think it's a minimal cost in comparison. But there is a scarcity around that, and that's the whole theory on Bitcoin. That there's only X number of Bitcoin out there that can ever be sort of minted. And therefore, that value is retained because the people who believe in Bitcoin believe in this theory that, the value of these assets should be preserved and protected, which money used to have that role pre-quantitative easing.
The gold standard was dropped by most countries. So there was no actual physical product that backed the value of the currency.
Yes.
I mean, correct. Pound lost the gold standard back in the 90s.
Yes. But even when you think about losing the gold standard, there was still a respect pre-quantitative easing that people weren't just going to print money the way that they were. But when you had the Lehman crisis,
there's no scarcity anymore.
Right? Exactly.
Real currency, real world currency no longer has scarcity.
There's no longer scarcity, and because the central bank can't go broke because it can keep issuing money, you basically have and politicians have gotten kind of addicted to the idea of economy's not doing well, let's go print some more money. But what they probably realized but didn't think about because of the cycles of election, because of the fact that they didn't care about the longer term, is that once you end up printing the money that you do, you're actually creating more wealth for the people who have assets and less wealth for the people who don't have assets, because they are actually the ones who get inflated out, because the money that you have in your account pays you less. And the insidious thing, of course, is that you don't even fully realize that maybe the cost of milk has gone up, the cost of your rent has gone up, the cost of your overall living has gone up, but the wages you're getting hasn't gone up the same way.
Currency devaluation.
Exactly, because you've devalued the currency, which is also the reason why things like real estate and other type of assets that can't be sort of inflated this way have increased in value. So the irony is that people are making less money broadly societally in terms of real money terms, and yet the real estate prices go up. So value of real estate is no longer a proxy for the health of an overall economy. It's only a proxy for the 1 percentile who have the ability to buy that. And we can see these kind of contrasting problems that are out there. But I think Web3 can fix this, because in Web3, everyone can now participate in these networks. It's not exclusive. And that means that everyone has a way in which they can partake in the growth of these networks, instead of only allowing sort of the investors or the small group of people, of entrepreneurs involved, to benefit from all that growth.
Do you think brands like HSBC, these big banks, are just going to collapse at some point? People don't keep their money with them and they take it out and they put it into this digital currency on the blockchain, which in theory is safer than a bank, right? It's less centralized, less easy to hack, less easy to get hold of, less easy to control. Do you see the end of banking as we know it, or can they adapt?
No, I think banking is already adapting. There's a whole number of banks that are basically looking at crypto custody. They're allowing people to own these assets. This Bitcoin spot ETF that just came out from BlackRock and all the major financial institutions like BILLIONAIRE and a whole bunch of others actually is the first step for major financial institutions to basically adopt these digital assets. So and eventually these spot ETFs, some of them are already things you can purchase at JP Morgan of all places, or Morgan Stanley, for instance, or HSBC. So I would say that, crypto is already moving into the mainstream financial narrative. I think, again, for people who still say, crypto's a scam and, it's something that is illegal, it's actually now something that's become an official financial product in the form of these spot ETFs. And I think Ethereum spot ETF is next. And even in gaming tokens, like, what we see with Ape and Sand and so on, they've created GameFi indexes, which now has an index on Bloomberg. But the next step for it is also to potentially become an ETF. So it's all basically sort of coming together.
So getting a little bit more technical and moving away from people that I'm assuming listening that don't understand it, we might start talking about, I've been studying it 3 years since I first interviewed you about this, and I asked you if NFTs were a scam and you explained it to me. Ever since that day, I've been obsessed with trying to understand how it works, and I'm still learning. It's moving fast as well.
Yes.
And I think, but one of the things I guess is interesting to discuss, can you explain to people the difference between, say, Ethereum and Solana, or like how the market is playing out when it comes to like how these products are different, and why, for example, Solana recently has gone up so much? What's actually happening there?
Maybe the best and easiest way to explain different blockchains, L1, L2s, is like nations, right? An L1, L2 has all the similarity of the frameworks of a nation in that they represent the culture and the community through a token infrastructure. So meaning that you can look at Ethereum as a country, and you can look at Solana as a country. And so that means that when you think about what makes that network grow is to understand its culture. And in the case of Ethereum, it's a builder culture. It's people who have been around for a while. They're sort of, I guess, the first generation of, hardcore builders with smart contracts. Whereas I would say Solana culture is much more speculative. It's much more of a newer economy. I would say, if you would, and again, it's sort of very compressed and simplistic term, but I think you can describe Solana as like the nouveau riche of the blockchain community in comparison to, I guess, Ethereum as being the slightly more conservative community. And then when you go to Bitcoin, which are basically sort of the old timers, in some ways you could sort of look at it that way.
I like that way. A lot of people listening about Ethereum wouldn't necessarily call it the conservative one. People that don't know it's not conservative in their mind. It's speculative, but it's more mature. Well, it's more established.
Yeah, and also, so for instance, when people buy, for instance, an Ethereum NFT, they are not thinking about it necessarily in terms of monetary value only. They think of it in terms of cultural value, right? So when you buy a CryptoPunk, there's no monetary design around a CryptoPunk. It's just status of having one of the very first NFTs in history that is yours. And you can basically say, hey, this is something valuable because of its sort of social status and social signaling and sort of goods around that. Whereas in Solana, many of the NFTs are being traded primarily because they're hoping for financial gain. And so it has a much more speculative nature, which is where Ethereum was 5 years ago. Right? So you can see sort of that evolution based on the particular cultures that exist around there. And I would argue that every blockchain has a particular culture, a particular community that they've built up, which also means that the future will have many blockchains in a way that we have countries and cities that basically become signals and symbols of the type of community that exists. So, that's one of the reasons why you can have a token infrastructure, for instance, for HelpBnk, because you're going to try to build a community that might be a certain type of person that wants to help communities, and they might not be comfortable being in an ecosystem that might be very speculative. That's okay. Then that's not for you. You go to another one. It's like immigration. Maybe America is for you because you like capitalism. Maybe Hong Kong is for you because you like uber capitalism. Or maybe you just want to go to Scandinavia because you want everyone to be fairly equal. I mean, it really depends. But of course, you pay more taxes for those social services in Scandinavia, and you pay almost no taxes in places like Hong Kong. And there's trade-offs, right? And these trade-offs have social repercussions. That's exactly the same that we see with blockchains. They're built in the same way with the same trade-offs in mind.
Such a great way of explaining it. So let's talk about Mocaverse. I just spent $4,000 on a Mocaverse NFT, and I couldn't be happier. I didn't buy it for speculation. I bought it because I really believe in what you're doing. But it took me a while to understand it. Explain for those that don't know what you're actually doing there.
The main premise for Mocaverse is, one, to tie in the network effects of the communities that we've invested in and built in, which is over 450 companies, but also all of the communities themselves. How do I build trust in Web3 without knowing who you are? Because right now, the measure of an identity in Web3 is your wallet, right? You can open a wallet and you can own assets, and the ownership of your assets is a way to say who you are, even if I don't know your name is Simon. But you need to be able to build a reputation in Web3. Today, the platforms that own the reputation networks are Google, Facebook, all the big platforms, right? If I log in and I use my Google login, then that becomes my way of sharing that reputation, and someone else accepts Google because they think Google has a great way of proving that you're Simon and proving that I'm Yat, for instance. But actually, the ownership of that belongs to the platform. If Google decides to take away your identity or your login, then you lose access to everything that you've used to log in, right? So that's actually a bad outcome. With Mocaverse, with decentralized identity, DIDs, for example, decentralized digital identities, you can actually own through the soul-bound NFT, which is an NFT you can sell. It's just your identity. All the reputation and all the sort of benefits that you accrue as a reputation you have as an individual on blockchain. And this is kind of a similar framework we have in the real world. For instance, you have a reputation amongst your friends, amongst things you've done, amongst your previous business success and what you've built with HelpBnk. And so people, because they know you're Simon, they might want to have business with you, or they want to hang out with you, or they want to give you benefits or work with you because they know who you are. How do you signal that, though, to someone who you've never met? Right? And that actually used to be in Web 2 in the form of seller ratings, stars, Uber ratings, right? But these are entirely anonymous people, and you trust a centralized platform to verify them. So Mocaverse is a way of doing that, but in a decentralized manner, in which you can move your reputation wherever you want, and also without revealing your actual identity, just by having this Mocaverse. I don't necessarily know, because you have the Mocaverse or the relevant sort of ID, which is free, that you're Simon. But I do know that you're an actual member of this community, and I do know that you spent $4,000 on it, and I do know that maybe you played this game and that you've been really good at this game, and therefore you get value for that. And this allows us to direct traffic into projects where those projects would then want those customers because they know they're verifiable users. It goes back to the advertising thing, right? Today if I want to promote a game, you wouldn't actually be able to properly, so you have to spend millions of dollars getting active gamers into the game, and the chances that those gamers actually play the game is maybe low because you don't actually know whether they like it, for instance, and they're the target audience. In Mocaverse, you can target them directly. One recent blockchain game that Mocaverse supported was Pixels. Pixels is now a roughly $3 billion, token economy when it comes to as a game. And we drove about a third of the traffic there. And it was a great partnership because every person who was basically in Mocaverse who was playing Pixels actually also ended up earning Pixel tokens for adding value to the Pixel network. And everyone won as a result of that. And so if you're a member of Mocaverse, you also get to benefit from having access to these opportunities in which you could basically become a gamer in these blockchain games, in which value could then be shared for you in exchange for you contributing to the network effect.
And again, I just love this idea that the community gets the benefit. Instead of you spending money on billboards and external revenue to get people into your game, you can connect to a community that benefit to get to be a part of that.
Great,
game.
absolutely.
And so just structurally, so, I mean, on the Mocaverse NFT that I've got, there's 8,888.
Yes.
Is that number just arbitrary, by the way? I always wonder why. Is it just, everyone seems to do 8,888.
No, a lot of them do 10,000.
All right. So that's a lucky number.
Yes, it's a lucky number in Chinese. It's part of the culture. And again, Mocaverse for us is symbolic and obviously the look, for instance, the 3 eyes is kind of a sort of an Asian sort of the third eye idea, right? Basically sort of discover yourself and sort of find your inner self is kind of one aspect of that. And of course, the number 8888 is obviously highly symbolic in terms of sort of wealth, prosperity, and all that kind of stuff as a symbol as well. But it's not. But we have, I think close to 1 million Moca IDs as well, which is basically your identity, which you don't need to pay for.
So, but explain that leap though. So the 8,888 original community,
yes,
they almost validate the Moca ID, so that you can invite people into that Moca ID.
They're basically, you can think of the core of Mocaverse holders, the 8888, as essentially the elders,
the DAO,
and the elders of the community, right? The first ones who help curate the community. That's also the community that, for instance, manages our ApeCoin DAO, for instance, in terms of voting for things and understanding it. They also ultimately in the future will get paid for that activity, right? So if you're a member of Mocaverse and you hold the NFTs, those become employment opportunities for you because you can manage aspects of our business. This is the other powerful thing about tokens. You can actually, we think of every person that holds a Mocaverse NFT and maybe also an ID in the future as someone who basically can find employment or is maybe even working for us in a certain manner. And they get paid for it in the form of tokens or NFTs or value because they add value to the network. This number will go to millions of people. You can't really think of any organizational framework that can properly and gainfully employ 1 million people, right? To give them the right incentives so they would actually do work for you. But in the token infrastructure, you can do that. And we can see this already. For instance, when you think about people who own Ethereum, there's some people who just own it, but there's a large group of people who are actually working on Ethereum for the benefit of Ethereum because they get network effects and value generated from that activity.
That's also what staking partly is, isn't it? Like you put your product into a future of that product and you get benefit if you're part of staking.
Yeah, I mean, in the classic sort of L1, L2 example, layer 1, layer 2 blockchain, staking is a mechanism in which you prove that you are sort of staking something into the network. You prove the validity of what something is happening. And proof of stake, which is essentially a mechanism where you validate the transaction that took place in a much more low energy framework than, for instance, what used to be proof of work, which is what Bitcoin and the former Ethereum used to have, right? So that's really sort of validated network if you're running a node, because you still need a node to essentially secure that network. And proof of stake is sort of, I guess, a more modern way of doing it because it's much more energy efficient, and also is, depending on who you talk to, a more accessible, democratic way of doing it. Because proof of work requires you to run a mining rig, which means you have to have equipment to be part of that network and might be costly.
I'm always so scared of all the legal implications around all of this because it all feels like it's not quite there regulation-wise. If at HelpBnk we gave all of our users an NFT for free, one, is that a good idea? And two, legally, how ramifications if people decided to do that, they listened to our idea that we're talking about and they did it. Is there something to be concerned about?
Generally speaking, giving NFTs, especially for free, is not a problem whatsoever. You see projects doing it all the time. There's no legal implications. It's a gift, right? And also, I think of it really as something that proves your membership in something. For instance, you can think of NFTs as a way to prove that you're a certain kind of HelpBnk user. Maybe you're a HelpBnk user that's helped many people. Maybe you get...
Yeah, we do have that. We have power users, yes. People that...
So those power users might get a more specific NFT that might look golden or might look something. Then that would basically be more rare. And that also means that... And the benefit isn't the fact that they just received this NFT. The benefit is that they can find each other. Because how do I know that, for instance, these 5 people are very helpful? How do I know that? And how do people outside of HelpBnk, that's the point, know that, for instance, as well? Right. So, for instance, if there was 100 sort of super helpful HelpBnk users that have gold standard NFTs, for instance, right? Those users would have a status symbol that others would come to them and say, oh, you're a real helpful user. Let me help you, or let me give you opportunities, right? Versus maybe someone who might have a more common NFT because they're a part of the network, but they haven't contributed quite as much. And again, that's actually a motivation for those people who are doing more work because they're getting more social status and recognition for having been helpful. What putting stuff on blockchain does is it expands the network. because people can see it. It's like having an open API or an open data framework so that everyone can see, oh, these are the users, these are the things they're doing, and this is how it can participate. That's really what the power of blockchain does. Whereas right now, everything's private and only you know, and maybe the people who own sort of the status in their private database.
And so for people listening, if they said, oh, I'd like the idea of issuing an NFT to my community, let's say you're a local shop and you've got customers that come in all the time, but want to bring them some value and do something fun.
Yes.
By the way, side note, but one of the things I think have got lost in the NFT, the value of NFTs, you touched on it, but I want to highlight it, is that if you're an artist and you make something and you sell it, that you get one-time fee. That's it. That's what happens still. So I was speaking to an artist a few days ago about this. They made a piece of art, they sold it, they made $1,000, and then that person sold it for $10,000 and they got nothing from that.
Yes.
So what I still love about the basic underlining principles of a product like NFT is that the original artist will get benefit over time. They get a commission of 5% every time, and that allows the artist. Picasso, who his first time it was sold, one of his paintings wasn't for $5 million. He probably got $100, but eventually it was sold for $5 million. And under the NFT model, under the blockchain registration model, that artist would always get a payment if they set it up right.
Right. So that's one model. But I think the other model that is has more value in terms of the long term is that you also know who the buyer of that art is. Because if it's sold 3 or 4 or 5 times over time, you ultimately know which wallet it went to, which means that you always have access to that customer, which means you can reach that customer for more sales or more relationships. And you also have a good feeling as to how distributed it is. And this is what I mean by network effects. If I'm a buyer of this NFT and I can now see in real time, oh, there's 10 people who paid $10,000 for this, then I own this NFT, or I might have an interest in this NFT. It signals to other people that there's value and sort of value creation. Today, for an artist, that value creation is opaque. I go to a gallery and it sells, and maybe a month later, it shows up in a magazine and says, this artist sold it for $10,000. Whoop-de-doo. This is great. But in that time, so much time has passed. The momentum maybe is lost. The network effects couldn't be built because the network effects basically were clogged in these sort of gateways that basically control that information. Whereas at Web3, one of the reasons why NFTs trade so much in comparison to regular artwork is because you have networks that show you that data. I can see it. I mean, if you could see, imagine in real world, if you could see every time a piece of artwork anywhere in the world was sold in real time, it would be a completely different market, right? And the same, by the way, in a different way is true for real estate. I mean, if someone was selling real estate and you would actually know the moment it was sold, what value it had, it would create a different kind of liquidity profile than the fact that it would be posted 1 month later in some kind of gazette, for instance, right? So really, putting it online amplifies network effects and also boosts value.
I actually had a really weird dream. There was a stampede of people once they understood how this technology worked that went and registered their properties on the blockchain, because I just sold a house in London, and if I had sold it on the blockchain, I'd make a percentage every single transaction potentially on that property forever. But I sold it once and that's it. Whereas whoever registers that property first and sells it on the blockchain, well, one, you could create an NFT that has to be sold alongside the property, which could actually become more valuable than the property at some point. But also, you're always going to get a piece of your property. So if someone owns a property today and actually put it on the blockchain and sold it, they could get a piece of that transaction forever. They could give that to their family as legacy.
They could, but I think also that to me is more a question of sort of how you want to create your network. So we're not suggesting that every NFT must have royalties, because that's up to you and how you want to build your network, because royalties is also a way to create friction into the network. So you'll find a future where some artists basically will charge no royalties because they want the art to be distributed as widely as possible, because they would find a way to make money to sell their future art to their collectors because they can now reach them. That's one example. Whereas there might be some artists who basically want to have a royalty because they might only have a certain number of art that they create and they want to have continued payment. My point is that this innovation allows people to have flexibility. So you could charge a royalty, someone else doesn't charge a royalty. It still creates a market that's open and where you can basically have free markets and capitalism sort of thrive as they need to.
Sometimes royalties can stop the speculation as well, though, right? I mean, these tools can be used to, if there's a higher royalty, perhaps people don't sell them so often.
Yes, but there's also a counter argument that it also basically hurts liquidity, right? So there's a balance. It depends on the product. I think royalties are relevant not for all products, shall we say?
Mocaverse, I forget. I think there's a 5%.
There's a 5%.
And what's the strategy behind that and that particular?
So the value of the royalty basically will ultimately go into the DAO, and which means that the community itself will be able to use the value that they generate from secondary sales
genius.
for essentially whatever they want to do in the future.
So that funds that DAO's activity.
Correct.
And that's brilliant. That's actually brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know. I want to go away now and give my community an NFT to start this process. How technically difficult is it to kind of create that sort of infrastructure? Because it feels, again, a bit like back in 2000, like building a website for people was so complicated. Now they're all templates.
It's the same. As in that there is a complexity involved, but it's not, I would say, sort of, the most difficult thing on earth. You don't need to have a PhD in programming or engineering to be able to sort of design a smart contract to do that. There's a lot of third-party tooling that does it already. Maybe the big difference, though, about launching on blockchain is that you can't roll back. Right? When you launch something, you basically becomes the final product in a certain way. You can't MVP it and then say, "Oh, you know what? That didn't work.
Want to pay?
Let's do a patch. Let's change it or something." Because the smart contract is fine.
You've got to know your end vision when you launch.
It's not the end vision. It's just that the product, the way you launch it, has a certain finality around it.
Right.
You can make it more flexible in the contract design, but if it's flawed, you have to throw it all out. And so what happens is that when a smart contract is flawed, it requires you to migrate your contract. Whereas in Web2, you basically just patch it up, and you basically say new patch update, push it out, and it's fixed. Whereas in Web3, actually you can't really do that because of the fact that it becomes a property which is more final. So that means you have an auditing process. You have third parties involved that basically create more security. So the security aspect of Web3 is much more loaded in front as opposed to in Web2, where it's something that happens over time, shall we say, if you were to sort of put in an inaccurate comparison.
Any examples of someone that's migrated that had originally started it and had to change it?
One example would be, for instance, if you look at CryptoPunks, the V1 version had a fault in the contract. So they had to launch V2 CryptoPunks. And CryptoPunks actually, the expensive CryptoPunks you're purchasing today is a V2 CryptoPunk. It's not the original CryptoPunk, because the original CryptoPunk was something that...
did they just reissue to the original V1s?
They did. However, but what's interesting, you can now buy a V1 wrapped CryptoPunk at a sort of pretty expensive price still, and it's created its own sub-community because they said, you know what, that was the original CryptoPunk. We just created our own smart contract and wrapped it and protected it from this sort of flaw. And so now you have two CryptoPunk collections, one of them which is essentially the V1, which is wrapped, and the V2, which is the one that everyone knows outside out there. And I guess it's kind of like you could think of the V1 as let's call it Picasso's draft design.
Yeah.
Right? Which is still an original, but it just has certain flaws.
His end visions.
Yeah, his end vision versus the V2. Yeah. But anyway, they both have value in the community. And again, it sort of shows you how human nature is around sort of, how we form value around these communities.
KSI is probably one of the biggest stars here in the UK. And recently it was proved on CoffeeZilla that he was pumping on Twitter, you should buy this token while he was selling it. But it was under a different name on the blockchain.
But they found it.
So they traced it.
Because it's on chain.
Yeah. It's not as big a news story as I thought it was going to be. But, he's telling his fans to buy something, and at the same time, he's selling it.
Yes.
Which, to me is like the holy grail on what you should never do with your reputation. And what I love about the blockchain, I guess it's all quite transparent. You can actually see the transaction happen.
That's right.
As the tweet's going out that you should buy this.
And also when things happen, let's say if he's promoting something and then suddenly someone's selling it, people will see that. And people are more suspicious and also wondering what's going on, for instance. So again, reputation is probably our most important human currency.
Right. Couldn't agree more.
Right. And tokens represent our currency in one form or the other, or tied to our reputation that we're building. And in the same way they can build up, they can also be destroyed. Except now they can have a quantifiable value to them, which maybe before was like, okay, you lost your reputation, what does it mean? But if you're actually selling a token or have an NFT collection, you can actually articulate that value very clearly.
One weird anomaly I find in this space, because transparency, decentralization, all of it, I buy into all of that kind of I love transparency and openness. Yet, weirdly, the people that you see in the space, tweeting in the space, you are one of the few people that have actually got your real name on Twitter. I'm one of the few people who've got my real name on Twitter. Otherwise, it's beardypunk. Whatever. And I don't actually know who these people really are that seem to be talking about crypto, that seem to be owning crypto, that seem to own the crypto punks, then it's not transparent who they actually are. That creates a strange dynamic.
But I don't know that it's necessary. I mean, we chose to put our real identity, but I don't know that it's necessarily important to know their real identity, because on-chain, we know what they actually really do. Because even if it is a fake identity, if he's built up a reputation online as an influencer, as an owner of these assets, whatever, if that person does something bad with that identity, he can never use that identity again. And maybe he can try to do something else in the future, and maybe he'll get away with it. But whatever reputation that person built, he has to start all over again, right? And that, to me, is a little bit like the physical digital equivalent of, well, maybe you were a thief in China, and then you left China and went to America, and, because nobody's
happening in the real world anyway.
Yeah, right? Meaning that, like you basically,
if you want to spend 10 years building up your reputation in China and then steal from people and move somewhere else, that's your loss of 10 years of your reputation.
Exactly. And that happens. Of course, today, the world is more global, and it's harder to do that. And in crypto, it's even harder to do that because you're on-chain in that activity. And you see people going back and saying, wait a second, this guy's transactions similar to this other person, or a wallet was funded from the same source.
Right.
There's all these things that actually you can trace back. And so ultimately, I would say people can't really get away from it.
I love being me on social media.
Sure.
But why are these people creating fake profiles then? What's the strategy? Is it a tax issue?
I think for a lot of them, it's about, remember, if they've been involved in crypto much earlier on, the regulatory framework was much more uncertain than it is even today, for instance. So there's those reasons. So people just wanted to do that. Other one is part of the culture. There was a time where everyone was just, I wouldn't say anonymous. They just ended up more working as a character, for instance. But they know who they are. For instance, Snoop Dogg. Everyone knows that, Cosimo de Medici is Snoop Dogg, but he still goes out. And the NFT world,
now you make me want to create a profile that makes me sound cool.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But so you can choose to be another handle, but at the end, you still know who you are.
Right.
But you are a different persona with that handle because you're addressing the community in a certain way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every person who has a different handle is intentionally anonymous. They're just representing themselves in this manner. And identity is one of those interesting things, because even in the physical world, I would argue that we have different identities in our different communities, even if we're not trying to hide it. You're different with your family than when you're at work, or when you're with your friends, or when you maybe even with your friends in one country to another.
I'm slightly different on TikTok than I am on LinkedIn.
Yes, exactly, right? You behave slightly different because it's more appropriate for the community, and therefore your persona has slight changes, even though everyone knows you're Simon, but you're Simon A versus Simon B. Here, they're just basically changing that by changing the name entirely to fit the community construct that they're in.
Yeah. Wow, I could keep talking about this forever, by the way, because I'm actually finding this stuff so fascinating. But I would love to just close on this. Thank you for investing in HelpBnk and helping us make this work. I love Open Campus and what you're doing there. So aligned with what we're doing. So we're going to work with those guys. Talk a bit about why you think the education system needs an overhaul. Talk a little bit about your plan there.
So the idea behind Open Campus, powered by the EDU token, is to create a global education movement that provides more funding, more capital to the kind of people that actually provide real value to the ecosystem. One of the powerful things around decentralization is the fact that we can basically shake things up from the ground up by actually giving value to teachers who can then create content from that can then be sold directly to the audiences. And because NFTs give you the ability to have property rights, and in this case, digital property, you can encapsulate intellectual property. You can sort of say where the money goes. You can basically capture the same kind of value with teaching content, the way that you could do with music rights or with other forms of intellectual property. One of the problems we have in the physical world is that I can't sell you a content really that has intellectual property if it only makes $100 or $1,000 a year. It's just too little, because the cost of the lawyer and the infrastructure and the negotiation is just too costly, which is why it's only worth selling intellectual property that makes maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, or real estate that's maybe worth millions of dollars, because the cost of doing so is just too expensive. But in Web3, the NFT can do exactly all of that, but for a cost that is less than $1, which means that something that might even only make $10 or $20 a year in terms of income from intellectual property of a teacher can now be a capital asset that could be sold for $50 to $100 because someone's happy to receive a 10 or 20% yield. Now, take a place like Venezuela. An average teacher makes around $10 to $15 a month, right? He or she can make content that might only make $50 a year extra on that content, but they could sell that content for maybe $200, $300, or $500. That's actually how wealth was created when you think about capital assets in the Western world. Real estate being one of those examples, but investments in shares or whatever. All of those have benefited from the growth of a capital asset, but only of a certain value. And now in Web3, you can do this with people who literally only make $10 a year. Introducing this framework of property rights into these countries, into these economies, is what actually creates wealth, creates economic opportunity. Also, it allows people from overseas to invest in those areas. And basically, we see teachers today who've been selling stuff on open campus make literally half a year to a year's worth of their salary. And what's also interesting, because they're builders of their own type, they don't just take the money and sort of buy something. You might spend some money on something. They end up hiring their friends. They bring their communities in. They want to make it bigger because their mindset is around building and contributing. Teachers are amongst the most underpaid members of society today, yet they provide the most valuable service to society in terms of where children spend their time, the things that they contribute to the world today, and it's high time that they receive the fair pay that they deserve today.
Well said. That's a great first step in fixing the education system. Pay the people that are actually in it better.
Absolutely.
So at the end of every podcast, we ask our guests to write down what they think the world's going to look like in 10 years' time. Are you up for it?
Absolutely.
Right, let's do that. Let's write it down and we'll keep it and we'll open up in 10 years' time and see how close you were to the truth. Right? Now we need you to send us an email. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge with us here at Free Humanity. Your knowledge is mind-blowing. I'm going to suggest right now to anyone listening, you should go listen to your TED Talk. If they really want to get deep into what you know beyond what they've learned in this podcast, they should go listen to that. And if people want to know more about you, follow you on your social medias. But again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and helping humanity have a better future. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.